All right, good morning. All right, I think we'll get started here now. The the chat already has the EDM music going, so thank you, Brian, for providing that. Um, yeah, so welcome to the first in-person meeting of the EDM program. Uh, so uh, today we're going to talk about mainly one draft, but I also wanted to give a quick intro just to what the program is for the people who haven't been on the calls that we've had virtually. Those have usually been relatively small and focused, but it's easier to have these things when we have an actual crowd to meet. David and I are leading this from the IAB side, but it is open to participation and input from the whole community, which is how kind of the current generation of IAB technical programs are working in general. So thank you for being here and contributing. Just so for some background on what the program is, as Mallory was saying, it's very easy to forget what EDM stands for since it has such a strong connotation in our minds for other things. But it is evolvability, deployability, and maintainability. So it's been running for like about 2 years now. It is a technical program that we have. So our goal is to have good technical discussions, work on documents when that's appropriate, but also just kind of figure out what are the right things that we should be doing as a community technically on things. And the topics here, yeah, I also cannot believe this has been 2 years. Yeah, weird. Evolvability, deployability, and maintainability. So evolvability, I think, is mainly around taking up some of the work that had been done previously in the IAB around preventing ossification, figuring out how do we maintain extensibility. That's related to one of the documents we've previously published. Deployability is looking at the aspect of how are we to make sure that we continue to encourage running code and interoperability, and are there things we can do in the IETF to make that process easier and better. And then maintainability is understanding what are the best practices for protocol maintenance and how protocols are going to live on after we finish their RFCs in the working groups. So we're trying to understand like what's the life cycle to make sure that our things are actually working. So as far as what have we done? We did publish RFC 9170, which was the use it or lose it draft, formerly titled the long-term viability of protocol extension mechanisms. We've talked more recently about how to associate implementations and try to help people who are working on code get things a bit more involved. Charles had written a draft of finding code, and recently we added some data tracker tags to explicitly call out related implementations. I know that was discussed, I think, at one of the recent working group chairs meetings this week. Can
you say more about that?
Oh, sure. So I think we need to do more publicity around it. We have talked about it on the working group chairs. Let's essentially say people try it out. I mean, the tags in data tracker have essentially related material for a document or a working group. Those are pretty flexible as it is, but we formally defined like a related implementations tag because we've done a survey of the chairs in general and just tried to see, how are people tracking these things. There's a big diversity, but having easy ways to, if you are coming to the IETF as someone who's just, I'm implementing this draft or this, I'm working in this group, who else is working on this? Where do I find the hackathon projects? If we can start formalizing and saying like, hey, if you're having great hackathon projects, let people know where they are such that if they're reading your document, we can tie those together. And so that's just like a first step. And we want to see with that, it's not really an experiment, but like, what can we do to use that and see how it goes in working groups? So I encourage people to use it. And I think it's a call that we should make that more widely known.
Sorry, another quick question. Is that just on drafts or also on RFCs?
I think it would work fine. Yeah, it should be both. Yeah, and you could also have it on a working group main page too, to say like, TLS could just say, here's my page where I list all the current TLS main libraries that you can play with.
And just in case you go to try to use this, one of the things I didn't realize was as much of an issue, perhaps limitation on it, or I don't know, restriction. If it's an individual draft, the person submitting the draft can go on add this. If it's already a working group draft or an RFC, the working group chair of the group that is in or came out
Has to
of
change it.
has to do it.
Right.
Yeah.
Which is, just kind of the nature of how data tracker stuff works. Like, I know I have requested some chairs to say like, hey, can you please add this tag for something I'm working on so that people can know how to find it. So maybe that's something that we can also improve the process on.
Yes, started using it in 2 working groups since Charles talked about it in the working group chairs lunch.
Awesome.
One of the groups that I sent it to, they actually had problems figuring out the fact that you could actually have multiple entries there, which is documented on there. So I helped them with that. But the part about how to add the label tag in parentheses is not documented or whatever. So we just need to advertise that part more, because I had problems with that, but I'm now using it and it works great. So.
Great. Yeah. And I think like when I had emailed out, I was like, here's the different ways you could do it. But maybe that's feedback we can take to the tools team of like, it should be easier to like have a form of just like add this type of tag with this label, add that tag with that label.
Paul Huffman again. So
Yeah.
I propose this is not just something for working group chairs. I mean, this sounds great.
Yep.
I haven't been wearing a blue dot in the last few years, so I didn't know about it.
Mhm.
If y'all, once you've done, like, once you feel like the documentation's ready and stuff, if you could send a message to, IETF saying this exists and such like that, I think a bunch more people will bug their working group chairs
Yes.
to do it.
Yep.
Okay, thank you.
So yeah, I mean, thank you for doing that. So like, I think as we get some feedback from the chairs initially, then we can say, all right, here's some examples of how people are using it. If you want to use it in your working group, bug your chairs. Yeah. Great. All right. And then for the remainder of the discussion today, one of the other things that we've been working on now on the maintenance side of the EDM trifecta is a draft that had been adopted by the IAB previously, quite a while ago. Draft IAB protocol maintenance. And this is something that has evolved. Martin was the original author. David took up co-editing it as a current IAB member. And we've had quite a bit of discussion on Architecture Discuss about some of the details here. So, in general, when we've discussed this on the IAB, it's something that we would like to move forward. We acknowledge that is not ever going to be something that is perfect and everyone's going to have complete consensus on, but we would like to get progress on it. And this is a good group, I think, to give some feedback on what are some of the refinements we can make before publishing. So with that, David, do you want GitHub or anything?
That's a good point. I didn't make any slides. We'll see if we maybe present bits of the draft. So thanks, Tommy, for the summary. That was good. We got some pretty spirited discussion on the Architecture Discuss list. Fun times, and we decided, oh well, let's chat in person. Things always work out better when we're face to face, even if virtually. So, what I was thinking is maybe starting with like the definition of the robustness principle that we chose to use in this document, because it became clear that those words didn't mean the exact same thing for everyone, and we had to pick one. We picked the one that was like the oldest RFC we could find. A sensible option. I can totally see that there are other interpretations, but just to set the stage, the overall message of the document is we had the robustness principle, which said, follow the spec, but you're going to find something, a condition that's like not clear in the spec, because it's not possible to make a perfect spec. Otherwise, we wouldn't have job security. And when you do, how do you react to that? And the leading idea in the 90s was you are liberal in what you get, meaning you take this erroneous input and you make do. You do not err. And that's like in RC 1958, the message there. No, not 58. No, yes, 58.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
And specifically, I think like the text we quote is like, allow what you accept unless the spec tells you otherwise. But the default is don't error. Just
yeah, exactly. This is for cases when you don't have the spec. Yeah. Yeah. Let me finish my quick intro, and then Dave, it's your first up. And then, so the message in this document is the world has changed quite a bit since the 90s. And what worked really well then and what actually got the internet up and running isn't necessarily the best advice that we can give today. And the document goes into some detail of what problems can arise if you follow this to its logical conclusion, and proposes alternatives, specifically protocol maintenance, when you have the ability to evolve specs over time and evolve implementations and their deployment of such implementations over time. So the document has come a long way in terms of overly focusing on the negative at first. We still have a ways to go. We have a PR that wants to improve this, but it's kind of the idea is the robustness principle is no longer the best thing we have. We have something else that is protocol maintenance. So now I'm opening the floor. Dave.
So first, let me prefix my comments by saying I think that's a bunch of good stuff in there that I actually agree with. Okay, and so the core point that you're trying to make in the draft, right, I'm in agreement with. Okay, I do have to admit that when I read the draft, I had a fairly strong negative reaction to the tone, and I'll explain why, even though I agreed with the technical points. Okay. And it gets to that same point about the robustness principle meaning different things. Okay, that there's at least 4 different things that you can think of, or that I can think of anyway, when you say be conservative in what you say and liberal in what you accept or whatever. 3 of which are good things, and 1 of which is a bad thing. Okay, and right now it comes across as saying the robustness principle itself is bad, and therefore all 4 are bad, and hence the strong negative reactions about the other 3 that are good things. Okay, and the things you're pointing about are bad things, I agree with, right? But the title and the tone come across as throwing the baby out with bathwater, which if you're not an English idiom person, that means you find one bad thing and you assume that the whole thing is bad. And so my list of 4 things, it comes down to, depending on how you interpret it, the quote from 760, which I agree is bad, right? That's the one that talks about the bad aspect of the 4 that says, when bugs come in, you should be liberal in accepting those bugs or whatever, which is the whole point of the spec, right? Got that one, okay. That RFC is obsolete. So some people would argue that that interpretation of the robustness principle is also obsolete. 1958, on the other hand, which is quoted, says, at least in my reading, the exact opposite. Okay, it says, if you see something that doesn't look right, you silently drop it. It does not say to accept it. Okay, it says to drop it. Okay, that's one of the good things. Okay, so the good things are if there are errors like a bug or whatever, that you don't crash. Okay, that's one definition of robustness, is that you stay up and running in the presence of errors, right? You don't crash. Okay, so one definition of robustness principle is don't crash when you see unexpected input. Okay, third one is robustness to attacks. Okay, someone's actually trying to attack you and intentionally sending you things that violate the spec. You should be robust to that too. Okay, so that's also both of the number 2 and number 3 I claim are purely valid in the interpretation of what 1958 says. In other words, the 1958 and 760 I see as being almost opposite definitions of the robustness principle in terms of if you accept and try to treat as valid errors versus if you treat as invalid errors and then continue on operation without detrimental effects, right? Both of those are interpretations of the robustness principle, okay? I claim that the invalid one is the obsoleted one in 760, and the correct one is the 1958 not obsoleted one. Okay, that's why my negative reaction, even though I agree with the points about 760's interpretation. The last definition of the robustness principle would be robustness to variations in mays and shoulds, right? Just because you do a particular variation of mays and shoulds, you still have to be robust to the other guy according to the spec, right? The spec, a well-written spec, actually is written that way to allow you to interoperate with people that make a different set of choices. You can argue that that's also liberal in what you accept in the sense of a different variation within the spec. Okay. All 4 of those are ways of interpreting be conservative in what you say and liberal in what you accept. Only the first one is the harmful one. Okay, so that's why I have a problem with the title and the tone. even though I agree with the content about that first interpretation being bad and all the good things that are in there are great stuff to have in there. So I personally would rather frame the document about, the correct application of the robustness principle, define it. So there's these 4 different interpretations, 3 of them are good, and here's how to apply them, and this one is bad, and here's how to do stuff instead. So that's what I would like to see the document become, and then I would very much support it. So
Thanks, Dave. Yeah, I'm seeing a lot of reactions coming to the queue, or people who just want to make comments. That's great. So I think everyone in this room can agree that if you get input that you consider as faulty, you shouldn't crash. I think everyone's on that same page.
right, but the document doesn't say that right now. It says the robustness principle is harmful. I'd be saying you can take that, but that's
No, that's true. I personally don't see that as necessarily the robust principle. It feels like common sense, but it's also that like it's been done for so long that I assumed it as one of the laws of physics, but maybe calling it a part of the robustness principle makes sense. And then same for reacting to attacks. Everyone's in agreement. Don't let attackers beat you. On the other on the point, and I think that's the one where maybe we disagree on this one, is if you get faulty input and it's not clear what the spec tells you to do, your options are to accept it and like process it fully. I think we can all agree that's a bad idea because that was the original one that got obsoleted. Another option is to discard it silently. And the third option is to error. And the idea, and that's what's very clearly written in 1958, and that's what this document says is harmful. And because if you discard it silently, you allow the other party to keep going and to never notice their bug. So you end up in a situation where I think this was a point that Stuart made, and I liked how he phrased it, was unlike other SDOs, the IETF doesn't have conformance tests. And so kind of the first implementation out there becomes the conformance test. And if that implementation errors when you send something bad, you're immediately going to fix your code. You're not going and then we go into detail in the document about this specific thing, but silently dropping instead of erring leads to an accumulation of these problems that leads to then people building workarounds. And you end up with the world converging to one of 2 states. If you silently discard, you end up with everyone kind of having workarounds for people for sending them the wrong thing. Whereas if you have a state of the world where everyone errors, you end up in a point where all the implementations are pretty strict and the state of the world matches the specification more closely. And that's a point that I don't think everyone agrees on, but that's what we're trying to get across in the document. All right, and Maria?
Yes, so I wanted to say the same thing, but in just less words than David just said. So about crashing, I think crashing is not part of the robustness principle. Nobody wants to crash their implementation. It's always an implementation bug, right? So I don't think that's ever on purpose. The difference is really what we're arguing about is like silent drop or not silent drop, right? And I think silent drop, and that if that's the only reaction, is actually always wrong. The minimum you should do is log the error, and you might even decide to like stop the connection and enforce the right behavior. And I think that's like always true for any protocol.
Thanks. Tommy?
All right. Thanks, Dave, for the kind of taxonomy of the different types. Okay, we aren't actually the same person.
You have to identify your Davids.
Yeah, exactly. I think that is definitely helpful. So yeah, I agree that you have the number one of just be liberal in what you accept, that one, obsoleted and not great. I definitely agree with like the number 3 and 4 of you have to be robust to attacks, and you have to be robust to the mays and shoulds, the things that let you have variation. Then I think the part I want to dig in on is similar to what David was bringing up about it's like the silent part. So like yeah, obviously don't crash. But I think the silent dropping is probably not the ideal state we're in. It can point to a problem in specifications that specification really should have you send an explicit error if the other side's doing something wrong. Of course, specifications will have issues and problems, and they will miss things. So they will have places where they don't tell you to do it. But then one of the other things, at least when we look at what we did in Use It or Lose It and talk about extensibility, we also talk about how you want to be very clear for what are your variation points and your extensibility points. So in those cases, I think we could also we could have an approach where you say the implementations, if they see something that they have no idea how to parse, should kind of just go to an error state, because a specification, if it intended to have an extensibility point that you're going to have variation on this in, it's on the specification to be very clear about what is my extension point, and so then you have to allow that through. And so, hey, I see a new packet type come in that I don't recognize. Okay, I'm not going to error on that. Now, part of this also, I think, matters on how reliable or authenticated the channel is here. Because if we're trying to make this work with the attackers, like if this is about how I process incoming IP packets that anyone can inject to me, obviously if there's something bad on that, like I shouldn't just like reset. I shouldn't do really abortive things if someone just injected one kind of packet of death to try to make me do bad things to appear. If that for some reason, like I can't authenticate it, you inject a UDP packet to me and now I close down all my quick connections, like that would be a bad state to be in. But if I do have an authenticated channel to someone, so I essentially know I am talking to someone on the other side who I believe is compliant with this protocol, if they start sending me garbage on something that is not an extension point and like I cannot parse, it probably is best for me to close that connection or have some sort of error. And ideally the specification tells me to do that. But if there is some weird edge case that it did not explicitly say, oh, if these bits aren't correct and you can't parse this and you're going to have a buffer overflow if you try to go beyond this when you're parsing the stream, you should probably close the stream rather than just like silently dropping packets forever. So that's, I think, maybe where some of this document is trying to get at. And I don't know how we name that aspect of it such that we say, hey, this one little bit in here is the part that we think needs more thought when you're developing the protocol as well as writing your implementation and trying to have like a default state for handling garbage input.
Thanks, Tommy. I see Brian in the virtual queue. Good to see you, Brian.
I'll see if you can see me. Hello. Good morning, everyone. So I was a little bit struck by Dave Thaler's sort of, thank you very much for, starting off with the sort of the taxonomy of different things we can do and the history of this. We're talking about some changes that were made to the interpretation of the robustness principle in a 3-digit RFC that were made in a 4-digit RFC whose first digit is 1, right? So we're talking about sort of like discussions that happened still 25, 30 years ago. What struck me about why this document exists, and something that I want to talk a little bit more about in this discussion, is that the way that the protocol development and deployment lifecycle works in the world has changed since that point in time. And pointedly, things that might make sense in one phase of the of a protocol's development and deployment lifecycle don't make sense.
Sorry, Brian, you cut out. Just you said point at things that might, and then it paused.
Oh.
Maybe turn off your video.
Yeah, let me turn off video. Okay. Is this better?
It is.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Crap, I don't remember what I said. Had I talked about protocol life cycles yet?
Yes, protocol life cycles have changed for deployment.
Protocol life cycles have changed. And pointedly, one of the big things that has changed is that sort of the development, early development and deployment and maturity life cycles, in a lot of cases, in many deployments, are going to overlap as opposed to being distinct phases of the protocol life cycle. So when we say, when I originally put myself in the queue, because it's like, I think we can all agree, someone said, I think we can all agree that you shouldn't crash. Well, maybe at early in the protocol lifecycle, if you're basically doing early interop, maybe the right thing to do if you get into an error state because the other side has sent you garbage is drop the connection, right? Like that might actually, in that point in the deployment, or if you're in an environment where you actually can do quick restart, that might be the right thing to do. So it might make sense to approach the differences in what we think the appropriate behavior are in terms of where we are in the protocol lifecycle, and acknowledge that the reason that this document exists now, and if published will have a first digit of 9 as opposed to a first digit of 1, is because that has changed in a lot of deployments in the world. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you, Brian. And next is Stuart.
Thank you. Stuart Cheshire from Apple. I agree 100% with what Dave Taylor said. Dave is always great at seeing a broader perspective and spotting out unconscious assumptions. And I think this is a great example of that. I mean, I love the taxonomy, and I think this should be spelled out in the document, because one of the first lessons I learned on my first job was, if your code crashes, it's your fault. You don't point at the packet trace and say, well, they sent the wrong packet. I've internalized this, but other people reading the document might not have learned that lesson. So yes, I think it would be great to spell out. You said something else that's probably obvious to everybody in this room. When we're talking about being less liberal with what you accept, if the protocol specifies a documented extension mechanism, like there's a TLV that goes here, you shouldn't drop the connection because there's a TLV there. That's not the kind of conservatism we mean. We're talking about being stricter about specification violations. We're not talking about being strict in the sense that I don't support the optional stuff and I'll throw a tantrum if somebody else tries to use it. All this is kind of obvious, but that's what you're great at, Dave, is spotting the things that the people in this room are taking for granted. And a document like this is supposed to be educational for the whole industry. So thank you for pointing that out. I'll give one example from one of the things I worked on recently, DNS stateful operations. We had a debate there, and I tried to be really strict. Everywhere in the document where it has a must, it says, this field must not be 0 if this flag is set. Well, anytime you have a must, what goes the other side of that coin is, yeah, but what if that's violated? So you're telling the sender, you must do this, but you also have to tell the receiver, and if the sender doesn't, what do you do? And in almost all cases, we've stated specifically, sender must not do this, and if it does, the receiver must abort the TCP connection immediately. Now, we could have said, silently ignore that one message and continue processing the subsequent messages on the connection. That would also have been a valid answer. And I didn't particularly care which we did, but I did care that we specified clearly in the document what you're supposed to do rather than leaving it ambiguous.
Thank you, Stuart. Back to Dave.
I was typing because I completely agree with you and would love that point to be made in the document. And I saw, I think Antoine or whatever made a comment in chat that it's to similar like why I put myself back in the queue. I think one of the good parts of the draft, meaning the main point of the draft or whatever, is David's point about sending errors rather than silently accepting things. I think one of the reasons, so if you get strong negative reactions on things, then I've found that in my experience, often that as somebody believes that it's being over applied to a particular case that they can think of. Okay, and so it makes me question whether it needs an often or a conditional must or something like that. So if I see strong negative reactions on stuff, I say, okay, am I over applying this somehow, and do I need to constrain? Is there some other case I need to call out? And I think it's the job of a good IAB spec to actually call out those considerations when those tussles or those things that occur that says, well, it's there most of the time, but this other case, maybe it's not, and you have to admit that or whatever. So I found usually when I see strong negative reactions, it's because they think that the statement is being over applied. Okay, and I think that might be the case here. Because I agree with the point that David made, right? That says if I've got a channel with somebody and they're sending a malformed packet to me, then I should abort the connection, send an error, whatever, rather than silently accept it. Okay, I said there's stuff, the main point of the document I actually agree with, right? So don't get me wrong. But there's some misapplication of that says if I don't already have a channel with somebody, okay, and I have a denial of service attack, for example, then in that case, it's often better to drop stuff rather than try to send an error, which can lead itself to a denial of service attack, right? If I send error messages, especially if it's an amplification where the error message is larger than the original one, so think of it as a tiny sin and a large thing or whatever. So there are cases where silently dropping is actually better than sending an error. And it has to do with this, do I already have a channel with them, okay? If so, it's better to send an error message clearly, right? At least I can't think of a counterexample, meaning, and that was the example you used, which I said, yeah, +1, +100, right? But there's also cases that you can misapply it to say, okay, you should send an error case in all cases and therefore open yourselves or the world to distributed denial of service attacks. That would be the over application. And that's where I think you get some negative reactions, right? And so whenever you see negative reactions, look for, okay, what's the corner case that somebody has in mind, and how do I change the statement to actually admit that there's a consideration, it's not a 100% case, whether it's an often or in the following cases or whatever. And so I actually agree with Antoine, and I agree with the way that you phrased it, David, and just making sure that the document covers both of those. That's what I think is a job of a good IEB document, is to talk about both sides and when different things are applicable, because otherwise the community gets into these fights in every single working group. And so the IAB's job is to write them down once in a way that we think we can agree with, to kind of preempt these debates inside working groups, or at least give them, by the way, here's the way to navigate that if you're a working group chair, for the people that haven't read the document. So that's why I think that there's actually a really good thing that the IAB document could do here, if it covers these various considerations while retaining the main point of the document here. I just think there's other things that should be put in there, and the title should be changed to actually broaden the applicability of the principles that are in here. So thanks.
Thanks, Dave, for so clearly laying out all these things. No, this is super helpful. Wes is next.
Thank you, Tommy, for giving up your seat. So I don't disagree that better guidance is needed for implementers, right? I think everybody in the room probably thinks it's time for a document like this, and to specification authors in particular too, right? Avoid holes. That's also, I think, fairly clear, right? Try and cover all the cases, but this document's for when that doesn't happen. I think the goal of any modern document, though, should be to inform the readers of their complete set of choices. And this document's not written that way. As I said on the mailing list, right, it should be twice as long, because right now it's written to attack one viewpoint. And it's written by sort of one corner of the market, too, right? As Brian said a second ago, protocol life cycles have changed. I'm not sure that's true, right? If you look at CPE vendors and router vendors and switch vendors and stuff, they have struggled to get any deployed equipment to be updated, right? Especially in-home stuff. It just doesn't happen. So the market space there has a completely different viewpoint from HTTP, implementers that are changing their code every 9 months, or every 3 months, excuse me. And the other big thing is that closing a connection on garbage may result in some devices is taking the entire network down. If you in your process of using, say, netconf or something to configure a router, take down an interface, get garbage, and then shut the connection down, you've just taken down a network behind it, right? So you need those rollback and other sorts of mechanisms. The other, important
to quickly jump in on that one, you made a really great point there. And when you made it, we did, and Martin wrote a section specifically because we realized, again, like Dave was saying, that there was an assumption
and
made
the
that we
new
hadn't
section is
clarified.
great, but the new section just specifies this document only applies under these circumstances, as opposed to helping all sides and writing the other half of the document that helps,
so
make a choice between them.
I totally agree with the clarifying the, and sorry, I'm jumping in as one of the co-authors, if that's all right. The caveats and the assumptions that we've made that were perhaps implicit. I do agree with you that for the other side of, like in those cases, this doesn't, what do they do? I think writing a document there could be useful. I'm not volunteering to write all that text, and I don't think we should block writing something on this half until the other half is written, because that's probably a lot of text, and I don't think we need to put them both in the same document. That would be putting quite a burden on us editors. And
So going back to my original statement, the right thing to do for implementers is to have the completely documented set of choices, no matter how hard it is. I agree, as I mentioned in mail, right? It should be twice as long in order to incorporate all these. Because there are times you really want to accept data and be flexible, and there are times you need to abort the connection. There are times you need to log the error, as Miria said, right? But then accept more after that. It's hard to write that generically in the first place. I mean, even the corner cases, we're talking sort of about two extremes. What about the middle grounds where in the end, you know, you actually need to give guidance to the user on what the different situations are, because even in one protocol, you may want to do one extreme thing in one case and another more flexible thing in another, depending on what the ramifications of that decision are, right? So writing the document in such a way that it started off with, in the original version, this is bad, it's just going to set a negative tone, right? As Mallory pointed out, that title still, you know, has remnants of that original discussion, even though the rest of the document, I agree, you know, has gotten better. But, you know, for me, if I was going to want to approve this, I'd want to make sure that the document had the best advice, like IAB normally gives, to the entire community, not just a section and not just against one particular past implementation.
Thanks. MT?
No. We're tethered together. That's hilarious. Thank you for that philosophical insight. So I'm going to partly disagree with Dave, but also agree with him. I think this is important because you identified four things. I think there's only really three that we're talking about here: the mays and shoulds and whatnot. The bounds of the protocol that entities interacting with that protocol are confined by, and the robustness principle does, I think, apply in those cases where someone steps outside those bounds. That's really what we're talking about. I don't think that there is a may. And anytime there's a may in a protocol specification, that's a must for everyone else. So I don't think that's really a distinct piece in this taxonomy. So I want to just sort of exclude that to start with. You're frowning. Feel free to.
I didn't follow.
So when I say,
if I may send, you must be prepared to receive type of thing, but it's not always true.
Not every may in a document is about may send. You said
Well,
every
sure.
may is a must for somebody else, and that's where you lost me.
oh, okay, so
I think I get what your point is now.
right, so
That's not, yeah, it's smaller than that, but
yeah, there's a lot more to it than that. And I just want to sort of set that aside, but I think the point about not crashing, not exposing yourself to security issues is something that we've sort of elided to the detriment of the document, and that's something that we need to address full on. The whole thing about silent drop and whatever else is, I think, a little bit of a distraction here to some extent. I think the goal of the document is to say when you end up in these situations, don't do the one thing that is specified in 1958 or worse, its predecessors. It's find some way to have the entire protocol ecosystem agree on what the outcome is and then write that down. And it says that a number of times. It probably needs to be sharpened. Something about sharp implements for sharp people. But I think that's probably the part that I continue to struggle with when I hear comments like Wes. I just can't. I need help in identifying where Wes is getting these misconceptions, because it's not what I'm trying to write down. And I didn't think that it ever said anything about the BGP case that's been talked about, right? So you receive garbage that's been forwarded onto you from someone else, and somewhere else in the network,
and you have to deal with the consequences of that, and you don't want to bring the entire network down. It's only one misbehaving entity somewhere remote that's causing this problem. Thing is, that has been documented by that community, and it's well specified now, and the behavior is fairly consistent amongst, well, at least amongst updated implementations. So I think there was one other point about update life cycles. This may be a point of philosophical contention, but it is my assertion that if you're on the internet and you don't have some means to react to changes in your environment, or it is a hostile environment, if you don't have some sort of immune system and ability to evolve, then eventually bad things will happen, probably to you, sometimes to bystanders. And whether we like it or not, in those situations where people are unable to update their devices, they're causing harm to themselves and others. It's not a desirable situation to be in, even though I recognize that I've got a router that hasn't been getting security updates myself. Something I have to deal with.
Thanks, Martin. Rob?
And just as a time check, we want to give room for people to get to the 10 o'clock. So I close the queue. We'll just try to go a little bit choppy through this.
We have Brian in the queue to have the audio choppy. It's good.
So I just have a few comments on things. So broadly, I think this document's a good document. I think it's a good idea. It's heading in the right direction. I think it's useful for us to be publishing something in this area. I do feel, though, trying to spin it a bit more in a positive way and make it less confrontational, I think that would help the community. So I think that's worth taking the feedback that's come in and trying to twist it slightly. And it's also clear to me, I think that some folks in the community are worried that this is going to be used as a tool to bash them on and say, your protocol's wrong, blah, blah, blah. And so we need to make sure that that's not the case. And that's where I have a lot of sympathy with Wes's argument of trying to make this very balanced on the two sides. And maybe we have, JavaScript, the good parts, maybe the robustness principle, the good parts would be helpful of having that sort of thing. And certainly where there's confusion about or different interpretations of the robustness principle, and I think some people think of it as an extensibility mechanism, and I don't think that's what it's about at all. So I think actually, why don't we write down what we mean, rather than just re-quoting the historical robustness principle, why don't we actually restate it and say these are the things that we think are good and worth using, and these are the things that we think don't work so well. I agree on sort of defining extension points in protocols rather than just assuming let's just sort of constrain what you're allowed to do, and anything outside that's just accepted and allowed. So I think I would like to see something published in this area from the IAB. I think having a bit more balanced view would be good and a little bit less confrontational. Thanks.
Thanks. And to be clear, we agree, as editors, we agree. And we're working on that. The documents started off as confrontational to get people excited and to start a discussion, and it worked. And in my take, we want there to be a little bit of a kind of a catchy start to get people to read it, because most IB documents don't get read, but we need to soften it even more, because absolutely our goal isn't to piss anyone off. Our goal is to get people to go, oh, there are many better approaches. So totally agree. Yeah.
Just one quick comment. When this gets published, this will get read and quoted a lot.
Well, that would be great. All right, Paul.
So I want to reset here because I'm really concerned with where the beginning of the conversation went, which was we should be emphasizing sending error responses more. Well, but people have been saying that's what we should be, emphasizing, the not dropping, but sending back error responses. And I have a concern because somebody who sent you a message thought it was a reasonable message to send. So they aren't really expecting an error response, even though it's in the protocol. They probably could accept it. That doesn't mean they're going to understand it. And one thing we've certainly seen in some of the older protocols like DNS is that once people start to like the error messages were supposed to tell you this and this, but more and more creative errors get the same error response, and therefore the error responses over time become less and less useful. And so pretty much, and even quite frankly in HTTP, the error responses are limited, and therefore the people who are receiving them aren't necessarily able to act on them in the way that we want in this document, namely to have people not sending things that cause errors. So I think that a thing that could be brought up in the send back errors thing in the section in the document is that errors themselves should be extensible. That is, as new, in the same way we have extensibility points usually for adding things to the protocol, errors should be extensible as well as a way of making it, and quite frankly, I think private use error messages are a great thing. I know this is like, I get beaten up on this a bunch, but it allows greater flexibility for the receiver to say, I got an error and it doesn't fit into exactly what the protocol authors thought.
Thanks. And honestly, I agree with everything you just said. Deborah. Deborah, are you there?
Okay,
We hear you.
there is a delay. As I've said on the list, the tone of the document, by making a blatant statement that the postal, right, is harmful, I think it's just overboard. And that is why you're not able to get your message across. There's no, buddy against having advice on how to do better protocol development, but to put that interpretation into postal, it's totally incorrect. That's not what postal has been saying. And as you've already been saying here, every protocol is different, and you may not want to put 100 pages in your document, but then you have to tone it down that this is not applicable for every protocol. And what you really want is that people are rigorous in the specification writing. So, but there's been a huge mixture, and the audio is bad, and I think there's a huge lack of understanding that everybody uses terms differently. For example, protocol deployment, is that demo code? Is it in a production network? For maintenance, are you talking about bug fixes? Or are you talking about upgrades, major upgrades? There's a huge difference in operational reality. So but it would really help if the tone of the document was not this negativity on postal. And that I would really is concerned about.
Thank you, Deborah. So just to clarify one thing, Postel's name does not appear in the document, apart from in the references section as the author on RFC 760. So we're not saying anything about. I know though a very early version of this draft said Postel was wrong, but we've toned it down. We've got and the document is much better now. It got that flashy thing that got people to the table, but yeah. And so I see what you're saying. Yeah, go ahead.
You still have that it's the robustness principle, and that we all know is postal. You can go to the Internet Society's website The description of the postal award cites the robustness principle. I would love to see, if you publish this document, that his principle is harmful. Go to the Internet Society and have them change their webpage.
Okay, all right,
And
thank you.
okay,
We're,
Just for time, we do have a couple more people in queue, and so I think we should just take like a minute on each person and then wrap up.
Yep.
So let's try to get through this.
Thanks, Deborah. DKG? Grab a mic, please, for the remote folks.
Switch.
And press the button. Big button. Okay, this is Daniel Kahn Gilmore. So this document does two things, right? It provides guidance to protocol designers and it provides guidance to implementers. And the robustness principle is sometimes thought to apply to one and sometimes thought to apply to the other, or to both. And I actually think it's subtly different, and it's important that it's different for the protocol designers and the implementers. And we are making a mistake when we apply the robustness principle to the protocol design, because it does have all the deleterious effects for interoperability that the document rightly calls out. So what the document actually says to protocol designers is, don't leave wiggle room in your protocol. Be clear about where things should be rejected or whatever. I'm not going to go into too much detail on the sending errors back. There are a lot of cases where we can't afford to send errors back. But I think the document could do a better job of calling out what the robustness principle means for each of these two categories, the protocol designers and the implementers, right? And it should actually say that implementers, if you find yourself having to apply this robustness principle because the spec is ambiguous, please help us improve the spec.
Thanks, that's great. Miria?
Yeah, that makes my comment very short because I wanted to say the same thing. I think this is very clear for protocol specification. We should do exactly what Stuart also said earlier. There should be no wiggle room, and that's the most important message of this document. And about deployment parts, if it's not well specified, then there's a question what you do. And I disagree with Wes. That's where I joined the queue, because I don't think I want a document that's very long and talks about all the different options. I think the message here is also that silently drop is not always the best option. So that's the big message. And I actually think IAB documents are best when they are short and give a very clear short statement. So I don't think we should cover the whole space here.
Thanks. Totally agree. Tommy, go ahead, and I'd like to take a minute after you to,
that's fine, yeah.
to conclude.
I got in the queue partly just to provide a comment as I was listening to these things as a suggestion, maybe to, particularly the title and how we phrase the whole thing. I kind of see two possibilities. One is, and it's too long, but you could call it interpreting the robustness principle in a world of protocol maintenance. Essentially saying when you have protocol maintenance or maintained protocol deployments, here's how to think about the robustness principle and here's how it applies. And another way to do it would be, because there have been many statements of the robustness principle, another thing you could just do is try to restate it to add a bit more nuance to some of these cases, or to just make it more clear. That, I think, if you go that direction, it gets into the more now you need to talk about all the different edge cases. And so potentially scoping it down would just be about saying, here is how you should use the robustness principle in this type of deployment, and understand no, it's not as simple as just being liberal.
Thanks. All right. So first off, I want to thank everyone who came over and who participated. I am impressed at how much more productive this was than the on-list discussion. The phrase I heard the most today was, I agree with you. Yes, and that was great, because seriously, we got really useful feedback that sometimes on the list, I was having a hard time understanding what people wanted us to change. And now this is very actionable changes that we can make to this document. And so in a way, because everyone has been saying this is useful, let's tweak it to publish it, not no, go away. So we're going to take that back. We're going to make those edits. And I think we're going to improve it quite a bit based on this feedback. So thank you so much, everyone. This was a really great conversation.
Thank you. Have a good Thursday.